As Sophia mentioned, I'm now based in Loughborough University. I'm a lecturer in architecture and urban studies, and I'll give you a little bit about my background in due course. But I'll just like to introduce the talk for today, which is going to be on this idea of ordinary urbanism and how it became extraordinary. So I'll talk about the relationship between parts and whole, the building unit and the city at the same time, through two examples of two metropolises. And while I'll be talking, what I want to invite you to be doing is think of in the background of this idea of structure. And I'm quoting here from the Metropolis Dictionary of Advanced Architecture, whereby we see this idea that structure joins distinct ideas or elements into a coherent entity from abstraction to concrete realization. So I'll be doing this throughout the talk. I'll be moving from abstraction to concrete outcomes in the built environment. I got inspired to do this research by early space syntax writing. So space syntax is a theory of space and society that was developed in the Bartlett School of Architecture at the late 1970s by Bill Hillier and Julian Hanson. I don't know if you've heard about this theory, but specifically Bill Hillier, in one of his early writings in the Acoustics Journal, introduced this idea of the architecture of the urban object. And a core kind of notion or idea within this architecture of the urban object was the definition and the notion of spatial cultures, whereby Hillier says that the way a settlement orders its space to configure the principles for ordering social relations is part of the culture of the city and has specific roles that influence and are influenced by the morphology of the urban object and historical processes in urban space. So there's a relationship between space and society. So these are ideas that are the background of this research that I will be talking about today. And more specifically, I'm interested in this interface between buildings and streets, and today I will investigate this kind of idea through the notion of structure, as I've mentioned. But if you think about urban theories like Jane Jacobs, Christopher Alexander, Hillier and Hanson, John Gale, they've all talked about the importance of streets in the life of the city. But one component that I found to be missing is the role of building morphology in the life of the city. So yes, we've thought about how streets contribute to ordinary and everyday life, but what about buildings? How do they contribute in this as a collective entity and idea? So this is a core bit of my research, and to give you a little bit more about my timeline, I studied architecture in Greece with Sophia, as she mentioned earlier. I was a lucky one. She was a really, really exceptional student. And I then went to the Bartlett School of Graduate Studies to study an MSc in Advanced Architectural Studies. That was a space syntax group, and this was my first engagement with a group. I continued to do my PhD in architectural and urban morphology. So this is the broader field that I will be talking about today. And that was at the Bartlett School of Architecture. I was funded by EPSRC. I then managed to get the doctoral prize award for a 2-year research on urban heritage. And now I'm currently based in Loughborough University. So this is my background. So when I was in the pink kind of area of my life, so during the masters, I noticed in London that many postmodern developments were being demolished, and I found that quite kind of a curious incident, considering, for instance, that at the same time we have terrace houses or row houses, very ordinary buildings that have survived for over 200 years. So this idea of why is this happening? Why did buildings that were not technologically or in terms of construction, obsolete. Why did they become demolished? Whereas we have buildings that survive over time and overcome technological challenges. Why was this happening? And in my mind, that was perhaps we kind of forgotten the lost art of building. We stopped engaging with that. So why is it happening that we still prefer to live in these ordinary settlements and sometimes newer architectural kind of solutions for the city become obsolete earlier than others? So I will use this idea of structure as, and I will approach it as a conceptual framework from the architectural to the urban scales. And I will investigate this in two urban realms, the London in UK and Manhattan in New York. And I will go through the urban histories of two building types, the terrace house in the UK and in London specifically, and the row house. So the reason I chose these two environments is because I could investigate the same building typology, a very simple building unit, a cell for the city, in two different grid configurations, so in two different urban patterns. And that was a very interesting idea to me. How do these relate? And how can the same building type produce so different urban cultures over time, starting from the same kind of building unit? And there has been this idea in earlier writings that the Manhattan is an anti-London, as Rem Koolhaas has stated, but also in the Urban Age project in LSE, again, they were again supporting this idea that London and New York are nice cities to compare in order to be able to understand urban change processes. So they can be very informative in this aspect. I will particularly emphasize the idea of the rules of aggregation of urban form. And I got inspired here from Leslie Martin's writings, and specifically The Grid as Generator, where he proposes that these rules, the rules of aggregation, are the framework of urbanization. So this is the idea that I'll be exploring. How different simple formal situations, the grid of streets, the pattern of blocks, plots and buildings can produce different urban cultures. And the, let's say, methodological background, although I won't be very methodologically driven today, I'll just give you the narrative of these ideas, comes from urban morphology. Mostly because this is, for me, it was an inquiry that had to do about space, so how space is arranged, how building units are arranged in space, but also it had to do with morphology. So being an architect, studying architecture, I couldn't really be detached from the idea of the form. And urban morphology gives tools to understand urban tissue through understanding the plot pattern, the configuration of plots, and the various specific ideas associated with building types, morphological ideas. So let's start with the building unit, and that is the terraced house and the row house in the two environments. You'll see here how they typically look like. They are quite similar buildings, and the standard kind of most prominent characteristic of these two urban settings is that the Blockfront morphology is based on an articulation of narrow buildings which are kind of sewed together, and they have similar or identical proportions and basic formal properties and characteristics. So we have these narrow fronts put together on a row to compose a block front that is really closely related to the street. So the relationship of the building to the street depended over time on size, on the architectural style, on the status of the inhabitants. So there are different principles that kind of relate to how closely tied to the street is the building entrance. So when we had stoop, the higher the stoop, the higher the status of the inhabitants. Keep in mind that these buildings started off as single-family houses. Over time, they became multiple apartment building units. Over time, in both typologies, we have the introduction of retail spaces. So a secondary use that is usually introduced on the ground floor or the basement where that was there. So there are quite flexible building types over time. So the idea that I like to bring up when comparing these two very similar building types and how they were put together to produce to compose the Blockfront is this distinction between uniformity, which we observe in the terraced house, and unity, which we observe in the row house. So I'd like to play with this idea that something that is uniform is not necessarily, something that is that has unity doesn't necessarily have to be uniform. And there are cultural implications behind these ideas. So let's have a look at the terraced Blockfront. So the Georgian London terrace house, the terraced house is part of a terrace, so a terrace is a row of terraced houses, is an example of vernacular kind of building culture which had austere principles of morphological order. So we can identify some sort of order in how the Blockfront is put together. And the idea behind this order was the reinforcement of a cultural identity for the urban realm of London. Of course, there were the small terraced houses that started off minimal and not as prominent in a way in the Blockfront as the one that I'm showing here, but still the idea of a uniform facade was prominent there as well. So the strongest morphological kind of feature is the row, this terrace that is treated as a unified Blockfront. And there are elements in the architectural facade that kind of amplify this idea, like the crowning. I don't know if you can see, yes, like the crown, then the body, and the base of the building. So that the architectural treatment of the facade emphasizes this idea that the building is part of a row, is part of the Blockfront. This becomes more prominent in later styles, where we see this uniformity being exemplified. So here you cannot really distinguish the different terraced buildings behind the terrace facade. And even in the later styles, like the Victorian facade, still we see this idea of a very seamless ordering of building units. And as I mentioned, Howard Davis suggests that this was used in order to reinforce the cultural identity of the urban realm of London. Now, it's really interesting to see how the terrace as a unit, this Blockfront, how it behaves over time, and kind of the social associations between the terrace and its inhabitants. So this is the Charles Booth map, which you might have heard of. It is the poverty, it maps out poverty in London, talking about social stratification. And it kind of depicts the building units, and specifically it matches with the idea of the terrace as a unit. It picks the social class. Now it's really starting to kind of notice here that perhaps at a change of angle, we might have a change of terrace and a change of class at the same time. And in the notebooks of Charles Booth surveyors, we read an example of such an incident, showing how the terrace behaves as a social kind of unit as well, not only as a morphological unit. So north of the board school, on the east side of Canonbury Road, is a nest of small courts with 1 or 2 storied house, respectable working class, they say, but once a bad family got in, would rapidly become a slum of the worst sort. So leave aside the social comments implied in the notebook, but keep in mind this idea that once an inhabitant, a family of a different social status was coming in the terrace, then the whole terrace would change at the same time. The floor plan of the terrace remained the same in different kind of sizes of terraces, and obviously the idea of the social status is reflected in the size of the terrace. So the more the wealthier the inhabitants, the more kind of prominent of this uniformity and specific architectural treatment, expressing an identity through architecture was observed. But still, it is interesting to see that over time, so these are 2 block fronts in Chapel Street in Islington, and you can see here the introduction of a commercial unit beneath the residential floors. And it's interesting to see how over time, between 2 historical periods, then the change comes seamless for the whole terrace. So the whole terrace was changing at a relevant rhythm as a unit. So a change at the building scale, either a social change or a land use change, was more likely to affect the whole block front. Now, going to the row house block fronts, I'd like to argue that while we kind of see this idea of unity and sometimes uniformity depending on the style, still there is this individual identity that the building unit is maintaining, and it becomes the prominent kind of feature of the block front. So, similar to the terraced house, the aggregation rules range from flexible to being more uniform, and that depends on the construction period. So the federal row house is much more flexible as a block front compared to later styles, the revival styles, for instance, around the Washington Square in the Greenwich Village. But early row houses, which were of the federal style, have this maintain the same facade width, but not necessarily the same architectural style and skyline of the block front. So still we are able to observe the individual buildings within the block. And you can see here that even in these more prominent architectural styles, still the coronation of the buildings, so the crown, still has this very fine architectural treatment that maintains the identity of the house compared to its neighbors. So they are unified in the sense of the pattern of the plots, but not necessarily in terms of architectural style. So there is a rhythm. They maintain the rhythm of the pattern of plots, but not necessarily the rhythm as a uniform block front entity. This implied that over time, of course, this relates to ownership as well, and speculative building. So speculative developers in London were more likely to develop the whole terrace at the same time, because London was, I will be talking about that in a minute, was developed through the estate idea. So areas of land being developed at the same time without necessarily having secured the buyer. This is what we mean by speculative building. Whereas in New York, we have incidents where the building unit, the row house, was built perhaps 3 at once before completing the whole row. So ownership was at the prevails at the building scale level rather than the block front or the whole block. And over time, this flexibility at the scale of the building allowed for tailored changes in the row house relationship with the street. So for instance, on your left, you see a stoop that has been removed over time and a direct entrance introduced. So we have this idea that a building can change independent of the buildings that are next to it. And here the varied kind of front that we observe after retail units have been integrated in the ground. So even in later developments of row houses being demolished, the block in New York maintains this rhythm, this underlying rhythm, but at the same time does not kind of requires a necessary architectural style. But the idea of rhythm is still there. So in general, the building culture enabled stylistic and functional appropriation, and therefore we have a greater number of changes and adaptations observed at the building scale and within the block front, so greater diversity and greater density of uses. These changes over time sometimes dismantle the uniformity of the block front, but still the underlying unity is there due to the pattern of plots that kept the sequence of the block front and an underlying rhythm. So what essentially I'm talking about here is this module of the aggregate, which is the primary building component of the city. And in the case of London, I would argue that the primary component is the whole block front, whereas in the case of New York, the primary building component is the building unit. And these are different ideas that have an impact on how these building types have evolved over time, and specifically the type of changes that they've accommodated over time. I'll move on to the spatial layout, and I'll talk a little bit about the interior, the idea of how the interior of the house was working for terraced and row houses, and then I'll jump to the city scale and talk about streets. Or in other words, about the private space and the public space. So the terraced house, they were based on each other as typologies, and they have a very simple layout. But one thing that we can observe if we start looking at spatial relationships of the different rooms is that the terraced house is mainly the main rooms in this layout, in this plan, are linked to the corridor. So we have a central transition space, the corridor, from which we can access the room. But that means that the most connected space in the house is this transition space. At the same time, the row house has connections both to the entrances and to the main rooms between them. So it is a different kind of configuration, same layout, but different type of connections. It allows of a more kind of free movement within the main spaces of the room. So you don't necessarily have to pass through the corridor to go in another room. Different kinds of relationships while using the domestic interior. What does that mean is that we have this very similar, so if you think that each node is a space and a link is a connection between these spaces, so the basis for these two typologies are the same, with the difference that in the row house typology, we do have this free-flowing movement within the interior. So it's a much more flexible space in terms of how it is going to be used, and it creates kind of equal opportunities for someone to be found within one room or another. So the distribution of activity in the house is in a way equally arranged for all the main rooms in the row house. Similarly, this idea that we have for a very kind of small building layout, we can start thinking about these ideas in the urban space, and this is essentially what the Space Syntax group have done at the Bartlett. So they look at how these different building units, in the previous kind of example it was the room, how they link together, how can they be arranged together in order to produce urban layouts. And we don't only have to think that structure as an underlying idea is only where we have a prominent order, so this is an ordered space. It can also appear in organic configurations, and there are mathematical relationships with which we can explore that, but I will not go into this today. So the City of London is more on the side of this type of configuration, whereas Manhattan is more on the side, let's say, of a more obvious order, so structure and order. And what does that mean? The City of London, as described by Julian Hansen in a paper that talks specifically about the relationship of order and structure in urban design, so again, like the inspiration behind these ideas. This is the historical part of the City of London, and you can see that there are geometrical relationships of linearity and the length of lines that relate to which streets are more prominent than others. So although London is a grid that appears not very ordered or there is no visible order, there is an underlying structure which is quite prominent. So we have these long geometric, more linear elements, these lines, along which London grew over time, and the kind of background streets that are shorter in length and different in terms of topological relationships to compared to these long linear lines. So we don't have visible order, but we do have a structure. At the same time, London was developed gradually. So we had estates, the Barnsbury estate, for instance, in that area that I'm currently showing, that was developed at once and not under a wider London plan. So we do have this genius loci, so an area that complies or thinks about the specific topological relationships of the landscape, but at the same time links to these longer arterial lines of the urban grid. So this is, that area is around here that you see, and this is the wider kind of scale, and you can notice the long linear lines whereby they appear as red, which means that this is space syntax analysis, so it is a type of analysis for spatial accessibility, and the warmer the color, the most prominent the street in terms of the of how it is positioned within the urban whole. And research has shown that these streets are usually, for instance, high streets. The most connected street is Oxford Street. So it is anticipated that streets of more prominent activity would be of more prominent role within the urban kind of grid. Now let's have a look at Manhattan. In 1811, we have the Manhattan grid, the Commissioner's Manhattan grid, and you see here this is a historical part. That's West Village, and above this line, East Village. Above this line, we have the development of the grid. And it's interesting to see here what Hillier Ballon notes, that the plan of the Manhattan grid condemned streets that served only their private advantage without a just regard for the welfare of others, and to almost total neglect of public convenience and general usefulness. So there's this idea that every part of this grid will be equally useful to the city and the citizens, which is a very interesting idea, and in my mind links back to this configuration of the building interior of the row house, this idea of the free-flowing movement, that all parts of the layout are equally important and have equal chances of being, in a way, accessed and used and occupied. Since I've talked a little bit about space syntax, I haven't talked about the methodologies, but I'll borrow an idea from Bill Hillier et al. That they've explored in this publication that I'm referencing here. They explore 50 cities, the street network structures of 50 cities, and they end up with these star diagrams talking about this relationship between a foreground network and a background network. So the prominent streets in the city and the least prominent streets in the city. And they developed this idea. They argued that Manhattan as a grid is a grid that has a very prominent order, so the opposite of London, obviously, but a very weak structure. So it's a kind of democratic grid. That's how they call it. A grid that creates equal opportunities over time for its spaces to being used. Now, the final idea in this parallel stream of scales that I try to introduce is this idea of planning policies, and specifically I'll talk about the urban conservation, because in my mind it gives an idea about the kind of heritage that these planning bodies have acknowledged in the urban realm. So what do they feel is important? And I've looked at two areas within these city configurations, Islington in London and the West Village in Manhattan. There are various reasons why I've chosen these areas, and one of them was that they had urban conservation areas established at the same time, or started to establish them at the same time, which was 1969. And you see the outline of urban conservation areas in Islington, and the outline of the historic district in Greenwich Village in Manhattan. And what I found interesting was that for Islington, the conservation area was an area that had a special character. And this character was not only akin to the building properties or to the architecture of the buildings, but it had to do with the layout of roads, the paths, the boundaries, the characteristic building and paving materials, the mix of uses, the landscape and tree cover. So it was a much wider idea than just architectural preservation, in a way. At the same time, in West Village, the historic designation report emphasizes this idea of the building, and the guidelines that they are preoccupied with was about this architectural treatment and how an architect is going to be built next to its surroundings. So still the building is the point of emphasis and the building unit of reference in this environment. So still we see a more kind of collective approach to the urban realm, an idea that uses and buildings will be structured in respect to a bigger idea, in the case of Islington and London respectively, whereas in New York we are still preoccupied with the building. And if you were to follow the outline of the conservation area, this is just the joints of buildings, the boundary of buildings that have been assigned with designation. So there are incidents where we have an extension to the historic district, which is just two buildings in a block. So the idea of the building remains very important. So making the ordinary extraordinary in these two different urban realms was, I believe, a matter of structure as a conceptual framework that was applied and conceived from the building to the block and to the city scale. So there are references throughout of a similar kind of treatment or principle of organizing urban space and urban life. So in London, Howard Davis points out that these ideas, the architectural ideas that brought together London, can be traced back in Enlightenment ideas, in which formal classification, like the way streets are classified compared to other streets, terrace block fronts are classified compared to others, it begins to fragment a formally unified picture of the world. So it's a wider idea that was beneath this urban realm. At the same time, in Manhattan, the grid has been conceived as a template, as a blueprint, where streets and buildings are components of a kind of spatial equality, and also permeability. So they're freely used, and they had their own stories and histories developed over time. So in a way, this blueprint served as a generator for architectural and morphological emergence, and at the same time keeping the rhythm of the Manhattan grid and the plan. So the key words I would like to take you away from this talk is, in a way, ideas that link to urban design principles and this regard that we might have first for the ordinary buildings. So we have studied this urbanism, but not necessarily the puzzle of the everyday architecture. And at the same time, bringing this link between the different scales through understanding the rules of aggregation, how things are put together. And specifically going back to Leslie Martin, starting with the scale and the pattern. So for the terrace house, the primary scale was the block front. This is different than the scale of the building unit. So starting with one component. What I tried to do, whereas these ideas of scale and pattern have been mentioned, was to try and tie them into cultural specificity. So where do things emerge? How do they evolve over time? And what is culturally specific about them, about architecture and about morphology? And in doing so, I tried to move beyond the kind of aesthetic evaluation of the built environment and think about non-discursive properties of architecture. This is what Hillier and Hanson in the Social Logic of Space, which is the core book that kind of put forward space syntax theory. They talk about this idea of morphic architecture as a morphic language. So thinking about ideas that are implicit in urban systems and spatial patterns. And finally, thinking of long-term processes and especially how these reflect the relationship of the part to the whole and vice versa. Thank you.